Good evening and welcome once again to the weekly Commanders Gridiron Show. I'm your host, Steve Lockman, where we talk all things on and off the field about our beloved Washington Commanders. And as you may notice, we are not in the usual studio tonight, based out of New Oxford, Pennsylvania. No. We are about 3 hours south, down at the lovely Massanutten Resort for the week. It's actually just a annual family thing that they get away for like the second week of every year. Do a little family bonding, a little family spending time together, skiing, tubing, lots of shopping. You know how that is. So unfortunately, we took the podcast on the road this week. And needless to say, I don't have the barrage of Commanders and Redskins memorabilia behind me tonight for the backdrop. So if there are any volume, sound, or video issues, I apologize for tonight, but we're going to see what we can do. And of course, as you know, for any of those of you who are NFL fans and or Commanders fans watching or listening tonight, there has been no shortage of storylines and news for our team over the last 36 hours. We could even go back 48 from Sunday's beating that we took from the Dallas Cowboys all the way rolling over into Black Monday, which was yesterday, as we know, and then, kind of where we go from here. So we got a lot to talk about. And, I guess you could say, fortunately, a lot of it does not have to do with the X's and O's on the field, but that's what we're going to start off with tonight. And, as we know, the Commanders played the Dallas Cowboys on week 18 at FedEx Field on Sunday afternoon. The game was actually flexed to 4:25 in the afternoon due to the playoff implications that the Dallas Cowboys had playing the Washington Commanders. And as we know, it wasn't really expected to have a good outcome on Sunday, that we went into the game with less than stellar roster compared to week 18 last year. If you remember week 18 of 2022, actually technically 2023, Sam Howell is actually his first start as an NFL quarterback. Sam Howell went into FedEx Field again and actually led the Commanders to a victory against the Dallas Cowboys in week 18 for his first start, first win. However, that didn't have the same outcome this year, as we lost 10-38 against the Dallas Cowboys, giving them the NFC East. As a note, for NFL history and statisticians and trivia gurus alike, this continued the longest streak in the NFL, where a non-repeat divisional winner actually won the division again. It's been 18 years that there have been a repeat divisional winner in the NFC East, and that is actually the longest streak in NFL history. Last time this happened was 2004, 2005, with the Philadelphia Eagles winning the NFC East in consecutive years. But back to the game, it kind of started out relatively mundane, so to speak, from a Commander standpoint, right? Dallas gets off. Dallas comes in with a high-profile offense led by Dak Prescott, who's arguably the best NFC quarterback this season. Kind of up there, even though the Eagles have collapsed here as of late this season. Jalen Hurts is up there, and Brock Purdy from the 49ers is up there, and, maybe another quarterback or two for the NFC. But let's give props where props are due, and Dak's been playing the way he needs to under Mike McCarthy to finish once again, basically with another 12-5 season. And as Paul says, not going to lie, in the first quarter, I thought, oh boy, here we go. This is the Cowboys let down in a big game. And you're absolutely right that, all signs were kind of pointing that way. Commanders came out to play maybe somewhat, hey, we're not doing too bad. And, when we look at it, it's kind of interesting that, look, the first quarter was basically The Washington Commanders defense came out as I kind of called it, and it gave way to itself in the second half. Specifically, I jumped on Paul and Dave's show, them 215 boys, last week with the Commanders Cowboys preview. We talked about what the Commanders were going to look like, what they needed to do to possibly secure the victory if they were going to, and just kind of get some overall feelings about this game. And I made the comment that, look, our defense, especially our secondary, is like Swiss cheese. The good news is we didn't play as much like cheese as I thought we were going to. We held CeeDee Lamb to 98 yards on 13 receptions. So even though that's a lot of catches for him with 2 touchdowns, the overall yardage was actually really good, especially given the fact that the week prior, CeeDee Lamb went for over 200 yards receiving. And, that says a lot about our defense. Pollard was their leading rusher at 70 yards on 17 carries with 1 touchdown. Hi, Eileen. Thanks for checking in. Hope all is well. And, as we look at what else happened in the game, in the second quarter is where it kind of started kind of evening up, right? After the Cowboys were up 7-0, Commanders come down the field with a decent drive. Brian Robinson rushes actually goes for a 1-yard pass from Sam Howell, ties the game on a Joey Sly extra point. And then don't you know, lo and behold, the special teams from the Commanders comes out, does what they need to do, blocks the kick for the Cowboys with good field position, and then gets a little drive going together. Joey Slide takes the lead for the Commanders for the 36-yard field goal. But, as the Cowboys do what the Cowboys do, they take that offense and they turn around and go right down the field again. And Tony Pollard scores on a 1-yard touchdown run. Cowboys go up 14-10. This is where you think, hey, it's going to be a back and forth game. It's looking pretty good for the Commanders. The Commanders, if they can keep up the momentum, kind of do what they need to do, it could be a spoiler alert for the Cowboys, giving the Eagles a chance to take the NFC East again, right? Eagles were having their own problems of their own with the Giants. And, subsequently, there was no fly, Eagles fly. It was more like they grounded themselves 6 feet under. But, it certainly shows that a lot can happen on any Sunday. And the Cowboys turned around after the Pollard touchdown and CeeDee Lamb took a 4-yard pass from Dak Prescott. They went up 21-10 at the half. So going into halftime, only down by, 9 isn't the biggest thing in the world. Hey, Dave, what's going on? Thanks for checking in tonight. Congrats on the NFC East title and a Cowboys victory. It's probably pretty exciting watching with your daughter from FedEx Field. Hope you had a good time down there, even though our stadium is a dump. Going into the third quarter, we know that's kind of where Dallas then opens up the floodgates and the Washington offense basically fails to get anything going. The wheels decide to fall off the wagon. And then it kind of becomes what our season really is and was, right? So that CeeDee Lamb scores his second touchdown of the game on a pass from Dak Prescott. Brandon Cooks takes a short pass from Dak Prescott. Holy shit, they're up 35-10. And then Aubrey does what Aubrey does and, nails a 50-yard field goal in the fourth quarter to make it 38-10. My prediction going into this game was that it was going to be around 42-17. And, in all honesty, I wasn't that far off. We definitely had the opportunity and the potential to score 17. Look, I said that we were going to get our field goals. We were going to get a touchdown here and there. And we could have squeaked out 17. And in all honesty, the Cowboys probably could have got another field goal and or a touchdown to make, my bet of, the over on 42 or at 42 very realistic. As Paul says, I love the fact that they ran a play for McLaurin late in the game when it didn't matter to give him the 7 yards needed for his 1,000-yard season. And you're absolutely right. McLaurin now sets the record for the Washington franchise to have the most consecutive 1,000-yard seasons at 4. He went into the game with only needing like 54 yards, 47 yards, something like that in the game. And, even up until late in the fourth quarter, they had tried to do some things to get him involved and even got him some catches to make that possible. But, in the end, he got what he needed to do. And he had 6 receptions for 56 yards, thus giving him the 1,000-yard milestone for the season. And, when he had a couple games this season where he just wasn't meshing with the offense wasn't necessarily geared towards running plays around their playmakers, et cetera, where he had a game where he had 0 yards. He had a game where he had less than 25, et cetera. This is a guy and a caliber receiver that should be getting easily close to 100 yards every game. And, if in fact that is the game plan going forward and something that you can target for, it's something that, he should be easily getting 1,500 yards every season, and something that's not even an issue whatsoever. But, Sam Howell kind of does Sam Howell things. Sam Howell started by default for this game because Jacoby Brissett was hurt for the second week in a row. So Howell ended up going 19 for 27 for 153 and 1 touchdown. The biggest factor of the fact was, once again, Sam Howell had 2 interceptions. Even though he had 2 interceptions, I did lose my lock of the game, with Paul and Dave, that I said Bland was going to have another pick 6 like he did the first time around that the Commanders met the Dallas Cowboys. But, hey, it kind of is what it is, right? And as Dave comments, he said, hey, we had a blast. It was a little chilly, but we hung in there until the very end. The ride home was a little long, but it was well worth it. And that's all, and that's what it's all about, right? A, that your team wins when you go to the stadium. And in this case, even though you're visiting, it was the fact that you guys walked away with the victory. But even more so, it's about having that fun time and, having that great experience with your daughter at an NFL football game, and hopefully, as the years progress, and mine gets older, that, I can take her to the sporting events, like you're doing with yours, and root my team on as well. And as Paul said, I seen a clip of Deron Bland. We knew what he needed, and we played a little soft off the line on that play. We respect him, right? Absolutely. And, it's interesting that I don't think watching the game, for the most part, I was only able to catch the second half of the game on TV because of work. But, one of the things I noticed was that the Cowboys were still playing semi-aggressive, but not as aggressive as they have, last week or the week before. Now whether or not they were trying to play a little less aggressive because of not necessarily, getting injured, or because they kind of knew that, let's be honest, somebody's watching the other divisional game and the Eagles were losing like 24-0 or, 24-3 or whatever it was, to the New York Giants. And that kind of played into it, whether or not it's because, let's be honest, they were up 1 point, 21-10, 28-10 at the beginning of basically halfway through the third quarter. A lot of that factors into it, right? But, they still kind of did what they needed to do, and, give the credit to the Cowboys. They come out on top 38-10. The loss kicks us to 4-13, and what could have been, or actually it ended up as of yesterday, what ended up being Ron Rivera's last game as head coach of the Washington Commanders. And it's super interesting that, once again, we end up on a divisional game, a highly competitive, highly contested game against the Dallas Cowboys in Week 18. And nobody would have thought going into this season that we were going to have the campaign that we did. A lot of people have expected us to be not necessarily like, the 12-5 or the 11-6 era, of competitiveness, but at least more towards the 500, right? 8-9, 9-8, somewhere around there. And, unfortunately we stunk up the field and, brought it home to 4-3. So, what does a 4-13 record get with first year ownership? It basically gets you the pink slip on Black Monday. And, as Black Monday is affectionately known around the NFL, it's the first Monday after the end of the regular season, which happened to be yesterday, January 8th. So as we know, as we currently sit today, I should say tonight on Tuesday night here at Commanders Gridiron, there is a slew of head coaching vacancies. Now, we already knew that there were 3 to 4 going into this weekend. And, we knew they were the Los Angeles Chargers, the Las Vegas Raiders, and the Carolina Panthers. However, as a result of Week 18, which is when a lot of ownership decides, hey, we're going to let the season play out and see what happens on the final Sunday. And then, come yesterday morning, then we're going to make those phone calls, those press conferences, and let things, out that, the coaches are cleaning out their offices and the lockers, and away they go. So yesterday morning, it was actually, I guess technically right after midnight, or right around midnight, into Monday morning. Arthur Blank, owner of the Atlanta Falcons, notifies Arthur Smith that he has been terminated or let go as head coach of the Atlanta Falcons. Ron Rivera was let go yesterday morning by Josh Harris and Company, primarily Josh Harris as the managing partner. And I think, there's so many fans and people that, just want to express their opinions and emotions and frustrations, or whatever adjective you care to use on social media. They're like, hey, I wouldn't even let the guy leave the field, wouldn't let him leave Ashburn, blah, 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 blah. But that's not Josh Harris's motive, right? It's not his MO. And, it's interesting because we're going to talk about Josh Harris's press conference from yesterday in a little bit. But one of the things that happened, Sunday was, even though it was Dallas week, Dallas day, it was actually Ron Rivera's birthday. And, even though Josh Harris doesn't typically fire coaches, and, he specifically said, hey, look, I wasn't going to let Ron go before the end of the season, and I wasn't going to do it, the day of the last game. He definitely wasn't going to let the guy go on his birthday either. Kind of what a crappy way to go, that, everything, the way this season's gone and everything's happening, right? As Paul says, I know a coach who's a great OC, who is a JV high school coach in PA. He's available to coach and he's cheap. Yeah, I'll add you to the list. And as we talk about the list later on in the second half of the show, I think you would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, number 10 currently on the head coaching candidate list. But, as many people, kind of myself included, kind of saw Ron Rivera's writing on the wall, kind of knew that his time as head coach of the Commanders was dwindling to an end. And as you kind of see on the banner and background here of Commanders Gridiron, there's a picture of Ron and I there to the left. And, look, Ron's a great dude. Ron didn't have necessarily the best winning percentage. He didn't have the best winning records. We only went to one playoff appearance, which happened to be a wild card spot in one of his 4 years here. But in all honesty, when you look back at the last 4 years, I don't think there was a better person or a better coach that could have been selected to steer the team in the direction and through the storms that Ron did, right? So there's a lot of people that are going to trash Ron Rivera up one side, down the other. And unfortunately, I'm not going to do that to Ron. And like I said, Ron wasn't necessarily the greatest person when it came to evaluating talent, to his draft classes, to, different decisions that were made on the field, his coaching styles, whatever, attribute you want to give to him. But the man came in and basically kept the ship from sinking. And it was something that, hey, look, we basically had the worst environment, the most toxic culture, the least desirable destination in the NFL. Nobody's going to argue that. And Dan Snyder had to try and find some individual that was going to replace Jay Gruden to come in and basically deal with the mess, right? So it was super interesting, as the selection process went on 4 years ago, here we are, that, Ron Rivera came out, or Dan Snyder came out, introduced Ron Rivera, accidentally called it Happy Thanksgiving, whatever, during that press conference. The press conference was like 5 minutes long. Dan Snyder never does press conferences, much less at all. And, never does Q&A forums with beat reporters and NFL insiders, etc. And here we are, less than 48 hours removed from week 18. And Josh Harris does a 5-minute introductory press conference and 15-minute Q&A with the pool reporters, which we're going to get into about here because it addresses a lot of the topics that we're going to talk about in the second half of the show. But, as we get back to Ron Rivera, Ron Rivera played in the NFL for a long time. He gets the NFL. He was a longtime coach for the Carolina Panthers, had decent 500 success, Super Bowl appearance, blah, 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 blah. So it'll be interesting to see, what or if anything Ron Rivera does from here. But as I said earlier, Ron Rivera kind of came in, needed to put some structure and the initial beginnings of accountability in place for this team. And as Paul says, look, I had to be hell under it had to be hell under Snyder. Rivera upheld the team name well with all that BS that was going on. You're absolutely right. Between dealing with Bruce Allen, between dealing with, I lost count at how many investigations Snyder would be going under, whether it was NFL, whether it was sexual harassment, whether it was toxic workplace, whether it was congressional hearings and investigations, whether it was investigations and prosecution from the 3 DMV attorney generals, whether it was, you name it, it was going on. And it seemed like Ron Rivera never had the opportunity to actually coach the team, but it was always more of a management and mitigation of team circumstances, right? So, I give the guy a lot of props, and then, oh, by the way, couple that with the fact that during his 4-year tenure here in DC, he had to battle cancer along the way. So, it was definitely an uphill battle the entire tenure for Ron Rivera here in DC. And I wish him well. He's a super nice guy. I actually had a chance to meet him a couple times. And one even most recently is like last November, actually October, November. I met him and he was super nice, outgoing, great personality as he always is, and still upbeat, even though the team isn't doing very well. But, aside from all that, that doesn't equal wins on the field. And, when Josh Harris comes to the table and, at the end of the season and says, hey, look, here's the deal. I have a great relationship with Ron Rivera. We think highly of each other. We respect each other. And Ron Rivera knew going into the season with new ownership, as well as even halfway, early to halfway into the season when a lot of fans and others are calling for Ron Rivera's job, that, he was open and very upfront with Ron Rivera that he said, I'm going to give you the whole season. I'm not going to fire you early. I'm not going to can you after the, Thanksgiving Day game against Dallas. I'm not going to can you the week after, whatever. Like, basically, you're going to have the entire season to do what you do, and I'm going to evaluate everything along the way. And that produces a lot of respect between head coach and owner, right? But one of the other things that was kind of interesting, as Josh Harris explained that about why he left Rivera in place, was he didn't think that firing a coach mid to late season was going to be very productive for the circumstances that were given the current environment here in DC, right? And I can't say that I disagree with Josh Harris on that at all. There's a lot of speculation that, hey, get rid of Rivera early, put EB in, see what he can do, but it's still the same people. It's still the same, aside from your defensive coordinator, DB coach gone, because that was the first coaching changes made by Rivera, was to let those two guys go. That, Josh Harris believes in the grand scheme of things, overall, statistically speaking, there's not a lot of production and productivity along with a positive change that comes out of coaching changes in mid-season. So he'd rather just wait, take his time, do it at the end of the season when it doesn't really matter, and kind of go from there, right? So it's something that certainly carries a lot of weight. It definitely kind of helps fans, media, reporters kind of show them where the ownership group and Josh Harris is going to go into the future, which we're going to talk about here in a little bit in the second half of the show. But it kind of also helps you figure out what Josh Harris's approach is to, and his vision going into further, the 2024 campaign and this offseason, right? So we knew that, when Josh Harris and company bought the team and basically made the transaction official back in, July, middle of July, beginning of August, that, $6 billion for a team, there's a lot to do. And there's a lot of evaluation that needs to be made. And, we knew that a lot of changes were going to be coming. We just didn't know when. We didn't know what days were going to be. And, we do know, hey, look, it's interesting that the team finished 4-12. Actually, the team was 4-12 going in to a lot of things, but that's kind of when the evaluation really kicked off, right? Week 15, week 16, you kind of have a really good feel for where we were at the beginning of the season, where we went during the season, and then kind of where we're finishing up, which is dead last in the NFC East again. But, Josh Harris isn't, I want to say, not accustomed, for lack of better words, to, the environment or surroundings of professional sports franchises, since he owns, multiple other sports as well. But, one of the things that he always does is he always wants to think outside the box, bringing an approach that may work in basketball or hockey over to football, and, kind of vice versa, kind of lean on, some things that, he can pull from other professional sports leagues over to his Washington Commanders with his other partners. And, it'll certainly be interesting to see, how that works going forward. We already know that he hired Eugene Shen, a big analytics guy who's had a lot of success and productivity in the NFL for other franchises. He's going to be, basically the head of, the analytic statistical side of things for our team. He brought in a renowned league representative for strength and conditioning and, training to review and evaluate that aspect of the team and operations. He has Mitchell Rails and Mark Ein and a couple others working on, the stadium venue and, sides of that thing. So, it's super interesting to see how Harris is going to take this approach that he has for his other teams and kind of put them together to work for the Washington Commanders, right? It's something that can work. It's something that, the fans are desperate for, and it's something that kind of needs to happen sooner rather than later. So watching this whole process unfold once again, it's not only going to be interesting, but it can also be painstaking, right? The fans kind of go through this every 3 to 4 years. So, of course, the fans are going to ask, well, what's different? What's changing? What's going to be, different in the next 10 years that wasn't under Ron or Jay, right? So Ron's tenure, was kind of defined by a couple things, right? Obviously, it had all the obstacles of investigations, league, congressional, financial, geographical. He endured 3 team names, right? Washington Redskins, Washington football team, and now the Washington Commanders. 2 owners, Dan Snyder era, now the Josh Harris and company era. And in his 4 years with the Commanders franchise, 8 starting quarterbacks, which basically resulted in a 26-49-1 record. And as Paul chimes in, how much does a Magic fall into this with ownership, or is he just a name and a voice? It's interesting that you bring up about Magic. Magic Johnson's a really unique individual and brings a certain business-esque and professional sports experience to the ownership group, right? One that, even though Josh Harris has a lot of ownership stakes and majority ownership in, hockey, basketball, professional soccer, blah, 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 blah. It's something, there's also a component that Magic has that Josh will never have. And that's basically the approach and perspective from a former athlete, right? As we know, Magic Johnson was a championship winning Hall of Fame basketball player. And, we're going to talk about it as we get into the GM and the head coach search. But Magic Johnson is probably, next to Josh Harris, is going to be front and center with a couple other key individuals that, are going to play a big role in who's getting hired, who's going where, who's being released, who's being, whatever you want to talk about as far as personnel on the management side of things are going to be changing, right? And can we just get a new mascot first, right? Commander Tutty. Well, it's funny you say that. One of the things, and we're going to talk about it in Harris's press conference, was, one of the reporters asked, hey, are we going to get a rebrand? what about the rebrand? And it was so interesting. But Josh Harris's biggest, or I should say, basically without missing a beat, basically said we're a little busy right now, right? With a head coaching vacancy and soon to be, or as of, this morning, a GM vacancy. He's like, look, between, trying to invest millions and millions of dollars into the stadium, trying to do a new stadium project, trying to do personnel changes, trying to do draft, trying to do, free agency, blah, 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 blah. Basically, a rebrand, rename, whatever you want to call it, is at the very bottom, if it's even on the list of things to do right now at this point, right? So it'll definitely be interesting to see what happens. So, we know going into it that Josh Harris had this big press conference, had this big Q&A, right? And what really came out of the Q&A. So, I think there's a couple things, and we'll talk about a couple now, and then we'll talk about a couple after we go over our sponsors here. But there are 5 takeaways from Josh Harris's press conference that are kind of worth noting, worth discussing about, right? And, we're going to talk about the fact that Josh Harris and the Commanders hired 2 non-football executives from professional sports to help guide them in their decisions for upper personnel decisions making, right? Like in the GM search and head coach. And those 2 individuals were Bob Myers and Rick Spielman. We're going to get into that after the break, but that's point number 1. Point number 2 is Josh Harris said that somebody asked him, I think it was David Aldridge from The Athletic, asked him what kind of a timeline are we looking at to get this done? And Josh Harris came back and said, quote, "It's going to be a thorough but rapid process." And look, Harris is the ownership group and the search committee aren't taking a path of finding a new head coach and head of football operations lightly. These are important positions, right? And he wants to make sure that they're given the proper amount of time and attention. But he also knows that there's not a whole lot of time on his side. We know that even though we're going into the playoffs, which the Washington Commanders are not a part of, the league doesn't slow down, right? So we're going into the playoffs. And, one of the things is, there's certain timelines and regulations about interviews and contacting personnel from other teams, yada, yada, yada. We're going to get into that in a little bit. But, it's super important that, once you can have access to certain people, that you do your evaluations, you do them thoroughly, but in a rapid way, right? We know that the off season is super packed with excitement. So at the end of this month are the Senior Bowls. And that's usually the first good spot that a coach, a GM, coaching staff gets a really good evaluation of college football players. Then, we end up going into the NFL Combine in February. Then we end up going into free agency for the NFL, which is usually the middle to end of March. And then April kicks off with the NFL draft, the last weekend in April. So it's super important that the coaching staff and management staff are together and selected before, basically the end of January, right? So it doesn't necessarily give Josh Harris and group a lot of time to get this figured out. But, as we talk about who's going to be interviewed and doing it, it's something that, they're going to be able to do in a short amount of time because they kind of know what they want. They kind of already know who they're targeting and who they're looking for. It's just a matter of, seeing if the people are actually a good fit for what they want. So, as I said, Harris responded to that question with, "Hey, look, we're going to have a thorough but rapid process in the weeks to come." Obviously, we need the next leadership here because we've got a lot of work to do. That work has already begun in earnest. And, the reports out of Ashburn have said that, we've already started requesting interviews from other teams for several candidates. And, something that was interesting, whether you use the word GM, Josh Harris keeps using the term head of football operations, which is basically GM. So, we're going to go over that list here in the second half of the show, and it'll be interesting to see what we're going to do. But Josh Harris continues to say, from my point of view, we're coming out of this poised for a great future. We've got a lot of draft capital. We got a lot of cap space, and I'm lucky enough to be supported by an amazing ownership group who shares in the visions that I do as well to put together a good management team. And, he's absolutely right. And we're going to see what happens with that. Third point that came out of Josh Harris's press conference is he wants a head of football operations in place before making that final decision about the head coach. He was actually pressed about this about at least twice that I remember from his press conference in the Q&A. And, because a lot of times owners may kind of do things backwards, that they hire the head coach and then the GM, or they hire the GM and not necessarily a whole lot of input or decision making from the GM about the head coach from the owner, like that kind of deal. And Josh Harris was very adamant about hiring the head of football operations, GM, and I'll refer to it as GM here just because it's easier, before selecting the head coach. And, one of the things that he said was, hey, look, there are a lot of people in this league that can do both and can do them successfully, but those two positions are going to be separate and they're going to be two different people. And, he said that he wants the group of 6 hires the head of football operations. He will listen intently to what the GM has to say as far as a recommendation and the dialogue for who is going to be the next coach of the Washington Commanders. So the way it sounds from Josh Harris is that whoever the GM selected is going to be selected is going to have a lot of say and influence on who the next head coach is, if not being directly selected by the GM, right? So it kind of almost sounds like the next GM is going to make the recommendation to Josh Harris, and barring any super red flags or objections from other people in the managing group, or et cetera, that whatever name the GM throws out is going to be the next head coach of the Washington Commanders. So, but Josh Harris says, I think those two things have to work together. And the fact that, those two people have to be able to work together, share the same vision, and kind of, be able to function together. So the fourth point that came out of Josh Harris's press conference is he wants to take the right steps towards creating a championship franchise. And, when new coaches get up on the podium every season, the dialogue and the garble is always, I'm here to win championships. I'm here for the culture. I'm here for the players, blah, 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 blah. But, excuse me, Harris has been a lifelong fan of the Washington franchise since he was a little kid. Used to even go to all the games. And, he wants to turn that around. And he said that a lot in his press conference in July when he took over as managing partner, majority owner of the franchise. But he also knows that it takes time, right? Because obviously, if we could write the script, it would be a quick turnaround. But on the other hand, you have to make the long-term decisions and do things 1% at a time, one athlete at a time, and sometimes those things take longer. That goes back to Harris and the ownership group's goal of creating the elite franchise, right? So, we know they're going to look at, even though they want the temporary success, we know they're going to also look at other NFL organizations such as the Kansas City Chiefs, the Philadelphia Eagles, 49ers, Baltimore Ravens, to kind of see how they are structured, how they operate, look at the culture, and how we can take the culture from DC to kind of resemble those 4 specifically and others cultures that, kind of make them Super Bowl contenders on an annual basis. And, I find that when you do things quickly like that, sometimes you actually set yourself back, is what Harris said. So my orientation is to make the right decisions and let the time frame kind of take its own course. Obviously, when you want that winning franchise quickly, but on the other hand, it's all about making the right decisions. And, that's kind of the big thing, right? With a lot of draft picks in this upcoming draft, with a lot of cap space, with the GM and the head coaching vacancies and a good list of quality candidates for both, it's going to be all about making the right decisions for the questions that come up. As Dave says, it blows my mind that the Commanders have their own marching band. I felt like I was in high school at the football game. Yeah, right. So it's interesting that you say that. And Josh Harris, as dumb as it sounds, one of the things he said was, hey, look, we're gonna do the little things, and he hit that on, kind of his message to the fan base, which was actually point number 5, and that was his message to the fan base, was that, look, he knows we're right there with the fans in terms of sweating every loss and not being overly enjoyed about the product that was put on the field for the 2023-24 season. Actually, 22-23 season. And, and how frustrating it was for fans to watch Washington struggle on the field. So he took the time to thank the fans and promised that, the improvement was coming. He's like, look, you guys showed up in droves. You believed in us. We sold out every game, even with a 4-win season. And now, granted, there were a few visiting fans there. Obviously, Dave was one of them on Sunday. But that's on us. We're not in the playoffs, but we thank you for showing up. He also made mention that, look, the future is bright. We have a lot of cap space. We have, a great ownership group. We're committed to winning for the city. And we look forward to showing you, in addition to telling you over the next series of years, what we want to do with our team. He also mentioned they're going to be doing a multi-million-dollar rollout from a business side perspective for the stadium. Not only what they've done already, but continue to do, knowing that they're going to have another 2 to 3 years in the stadium as well. So, one of those things is also keeping the old traditions, which, as Dave alluded to, hey, look, holy shit, you guys got a band? Yes, we do. And, it's super interesting that, I think as time goes on, you're going to see things kind of also revert back to kind of the way things were, right? Whether that's going back to a little more of more team colors from the past. Not necessarily the logo, because we're not changing the name, blah, 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 blah. But, just kind of the way it is. As Ken chimes in, he loved the marching band. It builds a heck of an atmosphere at games. And actually it does. So when I first started being a season ticket holder 5 years ago, actually 6 years ago, it was really cool because, growing up, you always saw and heard them on TV. But then to kind of experience that in the stadium was super cool. And at the time, I think there were only at least two that I know of, maybe 3 NFL franchises that actually had bands. And Washington and Baltimore were, I think, the only 2. It might have been a third. But it does bring a different component to just that game atmosphere, right? For fans, and that fan experience, and kind of rooting your team on, kind of makes you feel like you're in high school or college again, right? So it'll definitely be interesting to see if Josh Harris and company of owners can deliver on their promises, not only for improved product on the field, but improved product off the field, right? As Ken says, hey, I felt like the Commanders were better than their record. I kind of felt like we were as well. And, even though we finished 4-13, there were a lot of games. I won't say a lot. There were a couple of games that we could have, should have won that we didn't, obviously, but we were there. So, look, we took the Eagles, who before they had their end of season collapse and were really good. We took them to the brink and we took them into overtime. So we should have won that game. We should have won, a couple other games here and there. Obviously we got blown out a couple times. That is what it is. But, we could have easily finished around 500 and we just shit the bed. So before we get into the second half of tonight's show, we're going to tackle our sponsors real quick. And we are going to lead off with Monkey Cult Coffee. Monkey Cult Coffee for all your coffee needs. Jump online, use that promo code OOTB Sports for your 10% off. They have 4 great blends, including their newest blend, an organic blend, Peru La Florida, that complements very well with bourbon chocolate chip, toasted coconut rum, and the Sumatran blend. Get your coffee cups, get your coffee apparel, get your coffee grinders, and all your coffee supplies at Monkey Cult Coffee. Remember to use that promo code OOTB Sports for your 10% off, and try their newest blend, the organic blend, Peru La Florida, at monkeycultcoffee.com. Last but not least, Jason Fine, aka Attorney Big Al, can be reached at 1-800-HURT-123. Specializing in motor vehicle accidents, slips and falls, workman compensation, personal injury claims, has 3 convenient locations in Philadelphia, PA, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Give him a call. Tell him you saw us here at Out of the Box Sports Network, and he will hook you up. Remember, he doesn't win unless you win. Call him with any legal needs or advice for consultation at 1-800-HURT-123. That's Jason Fine, aka Attorney Big Al. All right. As we jump into the second half of the show, it's no X's and O's, but more personnel and management, right? And one of the things that came out yesterday that was kind of surprising, but I mean, I guess you could say it was surprising, was that Josh Harris and partnership, mainly Josh Harris, came out and said, hey, look, we hired two professional sports executives, non-NFL, kind of to help our team. The first of which is Bob Myers. Bob Myers may sound familiar to a lot of you sports fans. That Bob Myers started out, I learned, kind of winning from the ground up, right? And as Paul says, hey, Steve Kerr is coming for Golden State rebuild, right? They probably will probably hit the rebuild button here sooner than later if you're a basketball fan. And that's kind of where Bob Myers comes from, right? Bob Myers was a successful high school basketball player, actually went to UCLA, won a college championship with UCLA, playing basketball for him. Then he went into the sports agent side of things as well after graduating from college. So he kind of knows the player agent relationship type deal. Took an assistant general manager position with the Golden State Warriors. Only held that position for 1 year, and then he was promoted to general manager of the Golden State Warriors. For those of you that may not know basketball, he then turned the Golden State Warriors into a perennial championship caliber team, winning 4 titles with the likes of Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson, and others. So he basically turned a struggling California basketball franchise into a perennial powerhouse, right? And so Josh Harris, tagged Bob Myers to come over, help him out from, basically a professional standpoint, and Bob Myers basically said, I've been fortunate to know Josh Harris for many years. His commitment to building championship caliber teams is what drew me here. In my experience, championship infrastructure begins with a strong ownership group that prioritizes culture and invests in attracting the industry's most talented and innovative leaders. So basically, Bob Myers knows what it takes to put a winning team together, not just of athletes on the court in his case, but also from a management perspective as far as coaches and other assistants to him in the office of GM and et cetera, et cetera. So it'll definitely be interesting to see how he can bring his skills and knowledge over from the NBA world over into the NFL world to help the selection committee for GM and head coach, which currently consists of Josh Harris, Magic Johnson, Mitchell Rales, and David Blitzer. So that's the 5-person team. Last but not least, to round out what now becomes the 6-person team, was the hiring of Rick Spielman. Rick Spielman, as many of you may know, is actually a former NFL player and actually former executive of the year in the NFL and former general manager of the Detroit Lions, as well as some other franchises, but most currently and notably the Detroit Lions, where he was instrumental in their draft to kind of put them where they are today, so to speak, before the Dan Campbell era. And Rick Spielman kind of put out a statement similar to Bob Myers. Basically he's, excited and appreciative to get started with Josh Harris in the group. And he goes, I know how much this franchise means to Josh and how motivated he is to reestablish a culture of winning. Josh and his partners are willing to invest the time, the energy, and resources to build this franchise the right way, without cutting corners, and that is critical as you approach an important offseason like the one in front of us. I'm thrilled to apply my experience in the NFL and collaborate with Josh, Bob, and the ownership group, to identify the best leaders for this team. And as Josh Harris said in his press conference yesterday, look, both of these guys aren't going to be given titles for the team. They're basically advisors. They're not, hired to be GM. They're not hired to be vice presidents of something. They're basically advisors to me and the selection group. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, somebody said, hey, why Bob Myers? Why Rick Spielman? And, what can an NBA guy and somebody, from the NFL kind of do for you. And Josh Harris is like, hey, look, it's not, what can an NBA guy do for me? What can Rick Spielman as a former NFL executive do for me? It's what can their knowledge and skill base in putting together championship caliber teams of personnel and cultures do to making the team and culture here in DC 10 times better, right? And you can't fault the guy for doing that. His expertise so far in ownership has been hockey, basketball, and European soccer. So, for him to go outside the box and pull in people that have certain expertise, knowledge, or skills in different areas that he can kind of pull them in to apply to his group, as he tries to put together that championship caliber management side of things, speaks volume to him, Mitchell Rails, Magic Johnson, et cetera, right? So I think these two hires can do nothing but good for our team, especially Josh Harris, as he figures out who is next GM, head of football operations, and who the head coach is going to be. Which leads us next to our next discussion. As Paul says, as a basketball fan, he can build a foundation and bring in the players to win. He brought in Kevin Durant to win championships, pedigree to win, right? Absolutely. We know that, and I'll say David, and I'll use David. I'll use Bob Myers as the example here. He worked that single year at Golden State, then got promoted to the GM spot, brought in the players or the missing pieces that he needed to keep winning or continue to winning. There in Golden State, they already had Steph. We had Draymond. We had, Klay Thompson. We brought in Durant, and they brought in some other people, drafted well, and kind of made the roster fit for what it needed to in the NBA to make them be basically a powerhouse there out in the Western Conference. So if he can bring those same just experiences of management and direction to Josh Harris and company, it can do nothing but good things. So, which kind of leads us to, hey, look, now at first, Ron Rivera got the boot, and, what's going to happen there with head coaching? What's going to happen with Martin Mayhew, Martin Herney? And real quick, Paul jumps in and says, hey, the crazy thing is the players were not high draft players. They were built from chemistry. And it's kind of one of the things that Josh Harris is working on. Look, we are fortunate enough by shitty record that we have the number 2 overall pick that we're going to address here in a little bit. But, we have a slew of draft picks coming up in the 2024 draft. And we'll talk about that here in a second too. But, it'll be interesting to see kind of what all goes on with the draft and management vacancies. But real quick, before we talk about the draft, we'll talk about management vacancies. So as we know, yesterday was Black Monday. A lot of head coaching vacancies. Another one became vacant today in the Tennessee Titans, letting go Mike Vrabel, longtime coach, right? And as TechCost says, hire Mike Vrabel. So there's a couple of things about Mike Vrabel, and I can see some of the, I don't want to say lust, but some of the desire to hire Mike Vrabel. Mike Vrabel was a really good defensive coach, longtime linebacker in the NFL, former linebacker in the NFL. And actually, it's super interesting that Mike Vrabel spent 6 seasons as a Tennessee Titans coach. And the first 4 seasons went to the playoffs every year. The last 2 years, he had back-to-back losing seasons. He was actually, as funny as it is, named Coach of the Year in 21, maybe 22. It would have been last year, but it was at least like 21, right? So it'll be interesting to see where he goes. There's pure speculation, but a lot of gaining momentum that Bill Belichick's not going to be in New England come next season. So as Paul just alluded to, the biggest 2 options right now for Mike Vrabel is either going to be the huge college rumor that Vrabel's going to Ohio State and Ryan Day is going to be bought out. I saw that earlier as well. Or the other big speculation and rumor right now kind of gaining traction is that Mike Vrabel will take Bill Belichick's spot up in New England. So as much as Mike Vrabel has been a really good defensive mind and good head coach, it's kind of what have you done lately, right? And even though he's a good coach and he has put together winning seasons in Tennessee, his last 2 seasons have been less than stellar. So then the question becomes, okay, well, what causes all of that? But then, do we want that to come right over to Washington? Do we want candidates that are currently head coaches? Do we want candidates that are coordinators? Do we want GMs that are current GMs? We want the good assistants. What are we doing? So let's start with the GM spot, right? Which is who Josh Harris is going to start with first. And in no particular order or favorite, like ranking order of mine as far as who will get the position, even though we'll address that here in a second. Here's the list currently as it sits that the Washington Commanders have put out to other teams to interview these management people across the NFL. First on the list is the Browns assistant general manager, Glenn Cook, the Eagles assistant general manager, Alec Hallaby, the Chiefs assistant general manager, Mike Borgonzi, the Bears assistant GM, Ian Cunningham, the Ravens head of scouting, Joe Horitz, the Cowboys vice president of player personnel, Will McClay, and last but not least, the 49ers assistant GM, Adam Peters. So that's a list of 7 to 8 solid individuals across the NFL, from winning franchises or guys that have kind of restructured their teams, even if they're not at the top of the list in the NFL right now, are doing things right in the draft, have that experience and exposure to doing things the right way, are in winning or good cultured organizations. So, I think all of those guys, all those individuals would certainly do a really good job. Some would probably do better than others for us, in the GM spot. And I kind of listed 49ers assistant GM Adam Peters last for a reason. There's a big connection between him and Bob Myers, the new assistant that just was hired by Josh Harris. So, a lot of people put Adam Peters high on the list before Bob Myers got hired, right? Because of the work that him and John Lynch, had to think about that real quick, have done out there in San Francisco with the 49ers. But Bob Myers and Adam Peters actually go back, way back. They went to the same high school. They both played for UCLA. They're both UCLA alums. They've had a great relationship for some time. And Harris actually had a relationship with Peters before Peters became the assistant GM for the 49ers. So there's a lot of connections there between that triangle of people. So there's Adam Peters is actually the front runner right now in the betting poll for Bet Online and FanDuel to become the next GM for the Washington Commanders. So, like I said, any of those 7 individuals I think would do a good job. I think the best ones for us would probably be Peters, Cook, Hallaby, or maybe Borgonzi, in no particular order. But, I think you couldn't necessarily go wrong with any of those guys on that list. Now, the hotter topic. One other thing to mention about the GM candidates is GM candidates can interview as early as yesterday on January 8th, Black Monday, with no repercussion from the NFL for tampering, as long as they send out the permission request to the other team. Hey, we're going to interview this guy from your team, blah, 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 blah. It's not quite as restrictive as what we're going to about to get into here with the head coaching candidates. So head coaching candidates not currently in the playoffs or employed by a team can interview immediately. Those candidates, offensive coordinators, defensive coordinators, position coaches, whatever, blah, 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 everybody else that's non-executive, like GMs, assistant GMs, stuff like that, that are in the playoffs, teams have to wait until January 22nd to interview those individuals. So you can see that it kind of falls in line with what Josh Harris wants to do and the timeline that he wants to do it, right? So he's going to interview all these people, throw out this wide net, shoot a shotgun blast out to do his big thorough search for the GM, get the GM in place, and then, we can look at starting to interview non-playoff guys now to kind of get that out of the way and, off the list. And then as the playoffs go through, teams that, are kind of falling out and we have candidates on those teams, we'll start interviewing those guys. And then, of course, after January 22nd, anybody that's still on a playoff team, we can interview them as well. So the short list, I want to say short list because it's actually longer than the GM list for head coach currently as it sits, based off of written permission submissions to the NFL and other teams to interview and speak to, your coaches are as follows, in no particular order. Once again, is basically the Lions defensive coordinator, Aaron Glenn, the Lions offensive coordinator, Ben Johnson, who actually came from had time with NFC East teams, the Rams defensive coordinator, Raheem Morris, which is interesting, Ravens assistant head coach, D-line coach, Anthony Weaver, Ravens defensive coordinator, Mike McDonald, Cowboys defensive coordinator, Dan Quinn, Commanders offensive coordinator, Eric Bieniemy, Texans offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, and Michigan coach, Jim Harbaugh. As Paul says, at least the NFL does it right, not letting coaches transfer or make moves prior to committing. College football transfer portal, take notes, right? It is interesting that they do that. And it is interesting. I understand why they set the timeline in to happen. It's interesting that the head coaching process goes the way it goes with that time deadline, right? It would be super nice if the NFL would let, I don't want to say teams do everything now, because then, they'd be poaching coordinators and stuff before they go into the playoffs, kind of like college football does, right? But, it'd be interesting, or in a dream world, better if the NFL said, hey, look, you can't do your search until after the playoffs done, so it doesn't become a distraction for the guys that are in the conference championships and then in the Super Bowl, like it does every single year. But it kind of is the way it is, because, as we said, college all-star games are at the end of the month, which is before the NFL Super Bowl in February. So, as Paul pleads, just don't take Dan Quinn, please, but it makes sense, and then keep EB as offensive coordinator. So, Josh Harris was asked about EB, says, hey, look, we will have that conversation with EB. I think he's going to get a crack at interviewing for the head coaching spot, but, it's also going to be dependent upon who the new GM is going to be that is selected. And I think some of the searching or shrinking of I don't know if it's going to be shrinking of the list after the interviews, is basically going to be, with the GM's majority input, right? So, you look at that list, a lot of them, are quality candidates. At least a couple of those individuals will suffice for the Rooney Rule for head coaching vacancies, so that'll definitely be checked off the list as well. We are, let's be honest, let's call it as it is, we're going to be losing another minority candidate coach because Ron Rivera got fired. But there are definitely a lot of really good minority candidates out there, whether they're current coordinators, whether they're former coaches, waiting in the wings, whether they're collegiate coaches or whatever. So I definitely think you're going to see a couple get promoted into head coaching vacancies. Whether or not that happens with Washington remains to be seen. Whether or not the discussion to go offensive or defensive head coach also remains to be seen by the GM. There's a lot of discussion around the tables that, we already had a defensive-minded coach. Let's go offensive mind. Let's go young offensive guru. Let's go, if you take a defensive coach and you have a really good offensive coordinator, within 2 seasons, possibly 3, that offensive coordinator is going to be nabbed up for a head coaching vacancy somewhere in the NFL. So, why don't you go offensive head coach? Kind of like Sean McVay, Matt LaFleur, Kyle Shanahan, that kind of area, right? But you also see the good work that D'Amico Ryans did down in Houston this year. He's a defensive-minded guy. So there's a lot of, back and forth about which way the Commanders are going to go. I definitely think that there are a couple better candidates than others on that list. One of the biggest wild cards is going to be kind of where Jim Harbaugh goes if he decides to leave Michigan. And, look, every day there's probably 5,000 posts on social media from fans and media about what coach is getting interviewed for the commander spot, who is going to be the best fit, why they think it's going to be the best fit, yada, yada, yada. So, until there's actually decisions made about the GM and then the coach, it's basically a giant guessing game, right? And, Paul Spencer goes, I think Ben Johnson is the biggest name as a young OC, maybe head coach now, right? Had a lot of success up in Detroit. Was able to take that trade that they made with Stafford for Jared Goff and turn that offense around up there in Detroit. A lot of young talent up there in Detroit. Had some good drafting, and, he's done a really good job. If he doesn't become the Commanders head coach, he's going to become a head coach somewhere. It's just a matter of where. And, I think he's going to have a legitimate shot at being our coach. Slowick probably has a good potential of being our head coach as well, the current offensive coordinator of the Houston Texans, who used to be an assistant coach here in D.C. Will Raheem Morris get another shot at being a head coach? He was a head coach down in Tampa that didn't end very well down there. Along with a couple others. Mike McDonald with that amazing defense in Baltimore for the last 2 seasons. Can he come to DC and turn the DC defense into, Baltimore 2.0? That's a good possibility there as well. Look, we see what Dan Quinn does down in Dallas with those guys as well, even though it is a, divisional opponent. He would be a good fit. He's had a couple head coaching experiences as well in his past, that he can build on, so it wouldn't be his first rodeo as a head coach. As they say, as some guys, is it better for some guys to stay coordinators than head coaches? Who knows, but you almost got to take that leap and find out, right? Who has it better than Jim Harbaugh? Nobody, right? He runs the NFL to pick his landing spot. He certainly does. And, I would like to think that off the top of my head, the 3 biggest spots for Jim Harbaugh are going to be the Las Vegas Raiders, the Washington Commanders, and the Los Angeles Chargers. And I'd be willing to sit here and bet that, within a couple weeks, probably by, 2 weeks from now, he's going to be at one of those 3 positions. Even though there's a Carolina position, even though there's Tennessee, even though there's, I know I'm missing like 2 more, Atlanta, and some others, and possibly New England. Harbaugh is going to be in Vegas, in LA, or DC. It's going to be one of those 3. I certainly wouldn't be opposed if he comes to DC. He has the NFL experience. He took the 49ers to a Super Bowl. And I think that he could do it again, especially with our cap space and our draft capital. But we'll see what happens, and we'll see, what's going to be interesting and how everything works out. Paul says, I heard the Giants might bring Pearson as the DC if the Raiders don't tag him as head coach. I guess the biggest thing, and I didn't know this, or maybe they can, but, I would think that they would keep Pierce as coach for the stellar job that he did after the debacle there this season, and everything that happened and the way he turned that team around out there. But, stranger things have happened, right? And, excuse me, as I talked about draft capital, with the loss this week against the Dallas Cowboys and, a couple other games of help, most notably the New Orleans Saints manhandling of the Atlanta Falcons, the Steelers' victory over the Ravens, the Tennessee game, New England game, and I think there was another one or something like that. There's like 5 or 6 games. Washington secured the number 2 overall pick in the 2024 draft. So, with that being said, our current draft pick order looks something like this, right? So that we have the number 2 overall pick. We have the number 35 overall pick. We have the number 41, number 67, number 100, 102. So we have 6 picks in the first 102 spots in the 2024 draft. And as Paul says, how about those Eagles, right? Who would have thought? The Eagles basically, instead of fly, they basically grounded right into the ground, crashed and burned. Don't know what's up with them. It'll be interesting to see how they do against Kansas City. It'll be interesting to see how they do against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, against Baker Mayfield. But yeah, right. It's our division is super quirky. No rhyme or reason. Every year it's kind of different. Hopefully the order next year is kind of different as well, with us not being in 4th again, which I think we can do between the draft capital and the Cap space. Cap space currently sits for us around 90 million, with the salary cap going up another 12 to 15. So, you cut some players, we work some contracts, add another 5 to 10 million in there. You do have to allot, I forget what it is, 5 to 7 million ish for your rookie class. Maybe a little more. So you take that out, but you still have a really good chunk of change to work with in free agency as well. So we're actually sitting pretty good for a head coach and a GM, right? So when you look at, as I said, 6 picks in the top 102 with 3 more picks to go after that, actually 4 more picks to go after that. The cap space of 90 million plus, it'll probably be closer to 100 once they get everything said and done. New ownership group who's eager and wants to win and has a desire to build a winning franchise here in DC. And being in one of the biggest media markets in the country, let alone the world, is basically this open invitation for somebody to come and do what you're going to do best, whether it's being a GM or being a head coach, right? And it'll certainly bring out the best for people and it'll bring out the best candidates. And I think we're going to get some quality individuals in both of those spots, and I'm excited to see what happens going into the offseason for 2024. But last but not least, for the night tonight, we kind of know officially now that Week 18 is over and the records are finalized, yada, 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 who the Commanders' opponents for 2024 are going to be. We obviously won't know the schedule until it becomes released. As Paul says, hey, I'm seeing so many draft boards with either Drake May or Jaden Daniels. Caleb Williams gone at 1, but if the Bears take Harrison Jr. at 1, it keeps Fields to May. Yeah. I think sitting at 2, we're going to be pretty good, right? It all depends on what the Bears do at 1. Are they still invested in Justin Fields? Are they going to trade for Justin Fields? What are they going to do with Fields? That's kind of the big one. But we certainly have the opportunity to get Daniels, Dre. I'm not sold on Dre personally. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with number 2. That'll give us something to talk about next week for probably the majority of the show. Who we drafted 2 versus what our needs are, yada, yada, yada. But getting back to the schedule real quick before we close out tonight, we obviously have the home and away of our divisional opponents, the Eagles, the Giants, and the Cowboys, accounting for 6 games next year. But then at home, we also host the Falcons, the Panthers, the Browns, the Steelers, the Vikings, actually the Bears, and the Titans. Our away games next year are going to be the Ravens, the Bengals, the Saints, the Buccaneers, and the Cardinals. So, by finishing 4th, we kind of know, hey, look, we're playing the NFC East twice as we always do. We're playing the AFC North, we're playing the NFC North, and then we're playing 2 other opponents based off of 4th place finishes this year for next year. So that's what our that's what our roster of schedule actually looks like. Going off of paper and just going off the list, definitely a hard list of games, looking at where they finished this year. So there's not going to be anything easy about that schedule next year, especially finishing 4th in our division, when you're supposed to kind of get like an easier schedule, so to speak. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, all the changes that we're going to make in the offseason. And it's something that will obviously give us something to talk about here every week at the Commanders Gridiron. So with that being said, next week we have no game to recap because we're no longer in the NFL playoffs. So we're going to jump into, all the talk that Paul Spencer says the 2024 Super Bowl champion Dallas Cowboys. There's a good possibility with that, right? I think it's going to either come down to you or the 49ers representing the NFC. So it'll, be interesting to see what happens. Penix will fall in the draft after last night. Injury, and so many writers said he played soft as evidence of the NFL, so falling in the draft. There was some speculation that he was going to be at best an end of the first round, beginning of second round quarterback. He may stay there. 2 ACLs and whatever happened last night certainly doesn't help him out. We're definitely not going to take him at 2. I don't see us waiting, and taking him even later on in the draft. We're going to take somebody with a higher ceiling or potential than what Sam Howell's giving us if we do end up going that route at number 2. But next week, hopefully we have some more chatter and maybe even a decision about the GM position for the Washington Commanders. We'll kind of dive into a little bit more for the head coaching vacancies, see if that list has changed or been added to for next week. And actually, some of the head coaching interviews may be done by then. for the guys that are not on playoff teams. So we'll talk about that as well. We'll see what Josh Harris and company has up their sleeve and what happens over the next week. I guarantee, even though we're not in contention and, our guys are done playing, there's still going to be news over the next week about our Washington Commanders. So with that being said, join me next Tuesday night, same time, same place for Commanders Gridiron. I'm your host, Steve Lockman. Thanks for checking in.